Squeezing into its own mold, lessons learned from J.B. Phillips on translation quality. These words in the title come from the familiar verses in Romans 12:1 and 2 about not being conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And pretty much a recognizable verse in the Phillips translation, especially for those who've studied it and read it over the years. I could have used phrases like at sixes and sevens or hole and corner religion, metaphors that he used. And my particular favorite, to hell with you and your money, which does raise a few eyebrows, and it's found explained in a footnote, and I'll deal with that a bit later. What did J.B. Phillips have to say about quality? How does that impact us in our translation work today? What was the scope and purpose of his work? J.B. Phillips was a simple Anglican parish priest in South London in 1941, working in an environment of danger and death and emergency. 20,000 Londoners died in the Blitz. 1 million homes were destroyed. J.B. Phillips said he came to a point in his ministry, he was conducting unbelievably, 40 to 50 funerals a week. And somehow in the midst of this, he was hoping that he would give his youth group hope through the scriptures. And so he translated his text to fit the context of his audience. He didn't build a translation and make it say what he thought might be appropriate in a context of danger and emergency and hiding in shelters and under tables. And thus, if he had shaped it according to the context of danger, he would push the boundaries of accuracy. Instead, he tried to express the Greek text into English to reflect what he thought was the underlying pragmatic intent. He said, I undertook the work simply because I found that the authorized version, that's his consistent reference to the King James, the AV, I found that the AV was not intelligible to my youth club. And as someone, he said, who knew English very well and New Testament Greek pretty well, I endeavored to translate it so that my youth club could find hope in the midst of these great emergencies and dangers and bombings. And so off he went, and he began with the book of Colossians. The paper today is a study of various distinctives of Phillips' work, and we'll run the gamut from vocabulary choices to all kinds of typesetting nuances, and then with a closing, seeing how it might apply to us in our current translation efforts. In looking at vocabulary choices, consider Luke 23, verse 1. On that day, Herod and Pilate became firm friends, though previously they'd been at daggers drawn. Daggers drawn, that's emotive. It grabs you. It's powerful. It's gripping. Daggers drawn. Nice use of language. Matthew 13:24 in this context of agricultural work. Some blackguard, a word for scoundrel, has done this to spite me. Mark 2:14. It's not the fit and the flourishing who need the doctors. I'm fascinated with Phillips's use of currency. I noticed it in Matthew chapter 18, for example. He uses dollars instead of pounds. He talks about millions of dollars or a few pennies. So he talked about dollars and pennies rather than pounds and pence. And I do find that quite interesting in this translation published in 1958 by Macmillan in New York, a New Testament in modern English. Began with the translation of letters to young churches in 1941. Colossians 1:23b, the sacred mystery is now as clear as daylight to those who love God. And 1 John 1, for if we take up the attitude, quote, we have not sinned, we flatly denied God's diagnosis of our condition and cut ourselves off from what he has to say about us. I do find a few oddities in his work. For example, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he uses the phrase, not but what, not but what. For even when we arrived in Macedonia, we had a wretched time with trouble all around us, wrangling outside and anxiety inside within. Not but what God, who cheers the depressed, gave us the comfort of the arrival of Titus. I checked that with some modern speakers of modern British English, and they said they'd never heard the term not but what, but perhaps their fathers had used it. It's something along the lines of even so, or notwithstanding, or nevertheless. Prevarication is one. 1 Peter chapter 2, he was guilty of no sin, nor of the slightest prevarication. I do confess I've never heard a natural English language sentence with prevarication. Bestriding is in Revelation 11, the angel I'd seen bestriding the sea, or serried in Hebrews 12:1, surrounded them as we are by these serried ranks of witnesses. A general comment from Eugene Peterson, who said about the message, about the translator of the message, what he said about Phillips' translation. He said, Phillips gave me a Bible I could read, and I read. He introduced me to the world of Scripture, not just his words. He immersed me in its various marvelous sentences and helped me to feel the impact of its metaphors. Peterson was quite a fan of the Phillips translation, and I'll have another comment of his a bit later. J.B. Phillips made an extraordinary use of expansive and instructive subject headings, one of the brilliant pieces of his work. I will say it's really one of the most unique. And as I read the Phillips translation and read the subject headings, I see the preacher at work. You can tell he's a preacher. He's leaving the text, if you will. He's letting it shine through, but he's adding the preacher touch to make sure, as a teaching tool, that the message comes across. For example, let's look at a few in Luke. Luke 9:11, Jesus welcomes the crowds, teaches, heals, and feeds them. That gives you a good idea of what's going on, doesn't it? Luke 9:18, Jesus asks a question and receives Peter's momentous answer. Luke 9:21, Jesus foretells his own suffering. And while some subject headings might stop right there, he goes on with the paradox of losing life to find it. As you see these headings, you can see how the text fits in underneath and flows through that, can't you? And then one that I call fairly pedestrian is the next one, 9:37. Jesus heals an epileptic boy. With the way that Phillips constructs headings, I was expecting something like the father of an epileptic child comes to Jesus, tells Jesus that he foams at the mouth and thrashes and throws himself in the fire and begs Jesus to have mercy on him. None of that, just simply Jesus heals an epileptic boy. I'm sure he had his reason, but I was expecting more. Luke 10:17, Jesus tells the returned missioners not to be enthusiastic over mere power. 10:25 shows the relevance of the law to actual living. And then something interesting in 10:38, yet, and that's a continuation from the previous headings. They have section under 10:25. 10:38 begins with yet, emphasizes the need for quiet listening to his own words. The two subject headings join together to show how the two sections join together. So the subject headings are sort of a tailhead linkage. It's quite interesting. And Phillips does this not infrequently in the New Testament. The subject headings in the book of Revelation are really almost a study unto themselves and could be quite a 30-minute paper, no doubt. Let me mention several of these. Revelation 2:1, to the loveless church. Notice he didn't say anything about to the church at Ephesus. In fact, in all 7 churches, he doesn't even name them. He gives the description in the subject heading. He makes good use of this colon feature. Revelation 6:1, the first rider, conquest, and then the next riders and what they're known for. 8:7, the same with the trumpets. First trumpet, hail and fire. So on with the trumpets and their description. 16:2, and same with the bowls. The first bowl, ulcers, continuing onwards. And then again, 2 subject headings that tie together. Revelation 7, verse 9, the countless host of the redeemed, and verse 13, the countless host of the redeemed, explained. He continues to join and link these subjects, helping the reader to find the flow and the discourse as it was presented by the writer. He even has subheadings of his subject headings. And he does it with I, double I, triple I. The 7th trumpet, I, the worship of heaven. 12:1, the 7th trumpet, double I, the sign of the woman. And you guessed it, the 7th trumpet, triple I, the dragon, the enemy of the woman. So 3 different main themes or ideas, all tied to the 7th trumpet, in which he delineated with subheadings. We'll have another comment on the subject headings in the closing. This is a distinctive of Phillips, there are surprising to me KJV form renderings of Old Testament quotations and key direct quotation. I confess to you, this is one of the biggest surprises that I've come across in the Phillips translation. It said there are 300 quotations in the Old Testament in the New Testament. Some people count allusions or near allusions and bring the number up to about 900. I'm not making a distinction between those or even studying those. My point is that on the top level, Old Testament material in the New is a very big number. But Phillips did not translate those quotations into modern English. Instead, he left them as they are in the authorized version. Matthew 22, for example, from Psalm 110, the very familiar passage. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou in my right hand till I put thine enemies underneath thy feet. I would think that in translating into modern English, he would have translated this so that it was, well, in modern English, because it does feel very King Jamesy, doesn't it? Best I can tell is that he was intent on translating the New Testament text, which was freshly written in the first century, rather than translating New Testament Koine Greek mixed with underlying Hebrew or Septuagint from the Old Testament. Luke wrote in Greek, Paul wrote in Greek. That Greek original, if you will, was the basis for Phillips' mode of operation. Best I can tell, his motivation was to ignore any translation of non-Greek original text or non-Koine Greek, first century original text. So he left this as it was. I find it fascinating, a book that includes so much Old Testament material, lauded as such a quality and communicative translation, did not include modern English throughout. Well, here's another type of KJV oddity that sort of stands out as a sore thumb. This is not a quotation from the Old Testament. This is a praise that's given in Revelation chapter 11. We thank thee, O Lord, who art God the Almighty, and who art and who wast, that thou hast assumed thy great power. Now, why did Phillips leave it in King Jamesy English? Why didn't he translate that into modern English? I do not know, and if he were here today for the Q&A, I'd ask him. Best I can tell, there's something about this, and it just comes out of nowhere. It's not set off in any kind of block quotes or anything. Did he believe that it would supposedly lose some kind of, in losing the form, and lose some kind of holy, powerful moment for the saints around the form, and he didn't want to divert the attention to modern English? I don't know. Felt the old English was both established and clear enough here. Maybe it was holier. I'm not placing a lot of stock in that meandering or rumination of mine. Just wondering. Again, I'd love to have asked him. But it's a very noticeable thing as you read through Phillips. You're reading along, you come to all this King Jamesy kind of language. I thought this was supposed to be modern English. It's a distinctive of the Phillips translation. If it wasn't originally written in Greek, he didn't touch it, except for these odd bits like I just mentioned. Footnotes. I mentioned the one in Acts chapter 8, verse 18, so I guess I need to clean it up now. The subject heading here is Simon's monstrous suggestion is sternly rebuked. And the text reads, give me this power too, so that if I were to put my hands on anyone, he could receive the Holy Spirit. But Peter said to him, to hell with you and your money. And a footnote there is marked by an asterisk and reads, these words are exactly what the Greek means. It's a pity their real meaning is obscured by modern slang usage. Footnotes are sparse in the Phillips translation. I manually counted 5. And they're for such a kind of translator commentary as this one. They have nothing to do with alternate readings, nothing to do with cross-references, or any kind of comparative content study. It's simply some kind of commentary that he wants to make sure the reader knows that he's putting in there, but which he cannot put in the actual text itself. And so he restricted himself to 5 footnotes, and all of them along this line. Phillips makes liberal use of italics for speaker intent emphasis. Huge pragmatic emphasis. Matthew 3:13. Baptize me? Surely you do not come to me. Matthew 15:10. Not what goes into a man, what comes out of a man's mouth. There's a directional. And Phillips wanted to make sure we grab that. Matthew 26:47. At his trial. Why are you here? You hear the pragmatic emphasis. You hear the exasperation on the part of the questioner. Is that a piercing rhetorical question or a real question? Well, we can debate that for a while. Matthew 27:11. Are you the king of the Jews? The questioning goes on, and the pragmatic emphasis continues through italics. The sobering words from Mark 6, verse 14. I want the head of John the Baptist. Colossians 1, Christ in you. Yes, Christ in you. So on and so on. Next distinctive I'll mention is quotation marks, and he uses these quite liberally. Luke 11:14 is interesting. Jesus shows the absurdity of his being in league with the devil, end quote. Where did that come from? Well, in the next section, it says he was accused of being in league with, not the devil actually in the text, but Beelzebul. But in the subject heading, he took Beelzebul, turned it into devil, and the whole section he writes here is about the absurdity of his being in league with the devil. So he took some words from the next section, put them in the subject heading, and put them in quotes to show that's where they were. And he does this often. There's one interesting thing he does, such as in Mark 2:14. He has single quotes, righteous, sinners. It's interesting that it's not double quotes. I'm pretty sure that the editorial team of the Journal of Translation would query his use of doubles and singles, but that's the way Macmillan chose to do it. Colossians 4:13, fall asleep, quote, in death. All who are, quote, asleep in him, quotation showing that asleep is not a, quote, literal rendering of asleep. And whether we are awake or asleep, we share his life. Other features of Phillips that I'll mention includes omission of verse numbers. The only verse numbers found in Phillips are found at the end of subject headings, so that you know kind of where you are, or you will find them at the top of pages to show what is the first identified verse number of that section of the New Testament. Now, his omission of verse numbers was because he believed that putting verse numbers in would slow down the flow of the discourse, and he didn't want to see that. And would you believe it's this very same argument that Peterson made to his publisher of the Message. Peterson did not want to put verse numbers in. I read that in his authorized biography. He finally relented and assented because they said readers need verse numbers to find out where they are. Phillips said he didn't want them because they slowed down the flow, and so he made a compromise. He put them in the subject headings and not in the actual texts themselves. I don't know if any of you do that in any kind of minority translations. It'd be interesting to find out. He used 3 asterisks for separation of discourse, such as the end of Revelation 20. It's almost, you get to the end of Revelation 20, and it's almost if John the Revelator says, everything that I've just written to you has been in a certain discourse and bucket type of information. Now for something completely different as I come to a conclusion. And that's Revelation 21 and 22. And those 3 asterisks separate off the major part of the revelation. Another feature is his use of all caps in just various places. Here I've chosen a couple. 1 John 1, here then is a message we've heard from God. All caps, God is light. Again, rather than putting it in italics, and again, that would be another thing I'd ask him in terms of consistency in Q&A. Why did you do italics for some and all caps for others? This all caps, I think the answer would be, this one comes out as headline news and don't want anybody to miss it. It's not just a pragmatic emphasis, it's even on a different or higher level. That's what I've analyzed it as. Now, before he comes to Revelation chapter 6, this is not the subject heading, the Lamb breaks the seals. This is an all caps heading before a hugely momentous part of the book of Revelation. Again, putting it all caps to use it in that way. A lot of distinctives of this, and that's about all we can do in this length of paper. Let me close by making a comment on the 1972 revision. I put in the abstract there was at least 17 printings of the 1958, the original. Came time for 1972, and Phillips thought there'd probably be a lot of vocabulary changes, but he said he found out and had a staff working with him that there weren't as many changes as he thought they would be in terms of vocabulary choice. He said, English is not changing as quickly as I thought it would. Colloquialisms might be, but not using many of those. And he lists a couple of things in his writings that he did change, like little tin gods in 1 Peter, he changed to dictators, and plutocrats in James, he changed to the rich and affluent and so on. But not as many as he expected, even though they made thousands of changes, apparently, according to wording and grammar or style or whatever. But it was nothing really related to vocabulary choices. And I found that to be very interesting. particularly for one that a work that started in 1941. What can we learn from J.B. Phillips? What if he were a mentor to you, one-on-one translation tutor? Or what if he were the John Beekman speaker? What would he say to us as translation practitioners? I would think he would say, keep audience focus before you. Keep audience focus before you. Do you work with the people in danger? Well, this New Testament is well suited for them. Do you not work with people in danger? Well, the original context is still one to be mindful of and express as necessary. I think he'd also say, be creative. I've given you a whole range of tools and examples to help with scripture engagement. Be creative. The text is one thing, but there are a lot of things you can do around the text, the para-text, if you will. Oops. By the way, Phillips might say, did you notice what I did in Revelation? And I've just scratched the surface today. It really is worth a full study. I think Phillips would also ask us, is your language modern? If not, why not? Because his goal was modern language above all. What about yours? In terms of quality, Phillips would say, if it's not modern language, I question its value. I question its quality, and I question its value. He detailed his work in autobiography, The Price of Success. This simple parish priest in England had a very tough time at the end of his life. He was taken by surprise, really, I think, at the acceptance of his translation work. I think he was a bit overwhelmed and caught off guard by what happened. I mentioned the context of danger in which he worked and the terrible emergencies daily happening around him, bombing even of his own church and properties. But his work on the modern translation into English reached a global success. I mean, he became a global phenomenon. And this simple parish priest, to be honest with you, was not ready for it. And he confesses that here in his autobiography, a book that I commend to you if you're reading. J.B. Phillips was very open about it. He went into clinical depression because he could not handle the success that was placed in his hands. Even though he became quite a writer, other books that he's written, including The Ring of Truth, which is a statement on the authenticity of the New Testament documents. All that he experienced was so different than what he expected. And I think he would close today with saying, may God give you grace in your work towards quality in translation. And should the Lord give you extra favor in that quality of translation, may you be able to handle that success with grace and balance. And he'd sign his name, J.B. Phillips. He was quite a correspondent, apparently. He was very free in sharing his wisdom and learning. Thank you for listening.